For part two, Arctic Adventure. I just want to thank everyone who's come. I want to thank the Friends of the Library for sponsoring this lecture and for providing the goodies that have come back this year. So very happy. And I'll let Dan.
Okay, and I hope the people at home can hear it now. If there was a sound problem, maybe isn't it?
Yeah, I was on mute, so now it's
okay, good. So we'll just share the screen in a second. And as we do that, I just wanted to remind you that this is part two of our series of presentations on the race, as it would turn out to be, to the South Pole. Last time I saw you, we talked about the events that gave rise to early interest in whatever the southern continent may be. And mostly that had to do, as we saw last time, with the transit of Venus in the late 18th century. And ultimately, what's going to give rise to further South Pole expeditions, and it would turn out to be expeditions directed towards the South Pole, would be a different series of scientific questions. And it's those questions I want to talk about today. So if we share the screen, we can share the screen, we can get some idea about what people's minds as of the late 19th century. Does anybody know the deepest hole ever dug in the Earth's ground? How far have we gone down? You know? Really not that far, only 4 miles. And that's in the Kola Peninsula in the former Soviet Union, now Russia. And that hole that they dug 4 miles down is so deep that people of the Kola Peninsula often say that they can hear the whining of people in hell if they go by that hole. 4 miles is actually a pretty long way down, but it's nowhere near as far down as you have to go to get to the Earth's iron core, the outer core of the Earth. That's 1,800 miles down. And that outer core, as you can see here, is liquid in nature, and it consists of a great deal of iron, a bit of nickel in there, other things as well, but especially iron. And because there's so much iron in the outer core, the Earth is essentially a great big magnet. It would have to be with all that iron. And ever since the 16th century, as a matter of fact, Europeans have known that the Earth functions as a magnet. And in fact, the first person to postulate that was the physician of Queen Elizabeth herself, the guy named Gilbert, Humphrey Gilbert. The temperature there in the liquidy core, the iron core, the outer core of the Earth is about 9,000 degrees. It's a pretty hostile place indeed. But the consequence of all this, if you go to the next slide, is indeed that this great gigantic magnet that is the Earth is permeated by magnetic fields of various sorts. And those magnetic fields, a taste of which you can see up here on the slide, were of great interest to navigators. Because, as we all know, navigators, by especially our late Middle Ages, were making use of compasses. Compasses are very valuable, of course, in navigation. They originated among the Chinese, spread to Europeans during the Middle Ages, were in very wide use by the Age of Discovery. But compasses have a problem based upon these magnetic fields that permeate the Earth. And the problem is simply that a compass points in what looks like a northerly direction, but as people found out relatively quickly, the direction they're pointing in is not what we would call true north. True north is where the Earth's axis is pointing nowadays towards the North Star, Polaris. It hasn't always pointed towards the North Star, but it has since the early Middle Ages. It's going to be pointing to the North Star for a great deal of centuries to come. We're all very happy about that the Earth's axis points north towards the North Star, but that's not where the compasses point. The compasses point towards what's called the Earth's magnetic pole, the North magnetic pole. And as many of you remember, perhaps from last year, the reason this is all fun and confusing is that the North magnetic pole, which is in an easterly direction from the north point of the Earth's axis, is not really the North magnetic pole because the compass points north. And if a compass points that way, what it points to is going to be the opposite where the compass is pointing. So the North magnetic pole, which is in the north, is actually the South magnetic pole, although it is in the north. We saw that last time. And the difficulty with that is, in order to really make proper, accurate use of the compass, you've got to know the distinction, the angular distinction between the North Pole, pointing north towards Polaris, and the North magnetic pole. And the angular difference between those 2 points on the Earth's globe is called declination. If you measure declination perfectly well, a compass will be very accurate for you. But if you have no idea of the declination, then you might be in a little bit of trouble. It's not going to be as accurate a reading as you'd like to get. One thing we saw last time, remember, next slide perhaps, the most handsome man in the Royal Navy, although we're not going to see him now. He's too devastatingly handsome to show 2 years in a row. But handsome in the Royal Navy in the 19th century was James Clark Ross. And it was James Clark Ross who momentously, in the third decade of the 19th century, figured out where the North Magnetic Pole was, at least for the time being, on the Boothia Peninsula of Canada. And this is the moment of discovery when they figured out where the North Magnetic Pole was, a real boon to navigation. And that gave the Admiralty an idea. If Ross could find the North Magnetic Pole, which is really the South Magnetic Pole, why not send himself to find the North Magnetic Pole down in the south? And now we go to the next slide. And so the next big Antarctic expedition, after what we talked about last time, was James Clark Ross's attempt to do just that. And along the way, he found the beautiful Ross Ice Shelf, which you see here in Antarctica. And if you go to the next slide, he also was able to pinpoint not the precise location of the South Magnetic Pole, but at least a point in the general neighborhood. He didn't get to exactly where he needed to be, but he got within a couple of degrees, not too bad, of the South Magnetic Pole. And the way you know if you're near or at the South Magnetic Pole, which is really the North Magnetic Pole, is if the arrow of your compass is pointing down at a nice 90-degree angle instead of horizontal, which is where it is on the equator, for example. But if it's down like this, now you made it. You're at the South Magnetic Pole. Well, he didn't quite get there, but he did explore a bit of the Antarctic coast. He gave his name to the Great Ross Ice Shelf in the Ross Sea. And over here, as we're about to see, he gave his name during this expedition in the 1840s for a very special island. And I think that's the next slide. And this is Ross Island. You don't mind naming things that Ross is a nice name. Why not? So this is Ross Island. And Ross Island is right on the cusp between the Great Ross Ice Shelf and McMurdo Sound, which would become famous in the annals of Antarctic exploration as the years went on. And on Ross Island, here we have these two great mountains, Mount Erebus here and Mount Terror there. You might remember from last time that Ross named those mountains after his ships, the bomb vessels Erebus and Terror. And it was those ships that would eventually be captained by Franklin on his ill-fated expedition to find the Northwest Passage a little bit later on. And these mountains still bear the names of those vessels to this day. So these were pretty important expeditions, but they didn't quite find the South Magnetic Pole, unfortunately. It moves around, just as the North Magnetic Pole was. But that left a great goal, and that was how to actually come closer to that location of the South Magnetic Pole, and therefore provide to navigators the exactitude that they would need in order to make the right kinds of calculations. By the late 19th century, these efforts to really pinpoint not just the South Magnetic Pole, but to figure out as much data as they could to try to figure out declination angles and all the things that you would need for proper navigation had become almost an obsession by the late 19th century. And in fact, it got itself a name. It's known as the Great Magnetic Crusade. You can just find out everything you need to know. If you could just compile the data, we would have a better idea
keeps going out.
and a much more systematic approach to navigation. And if you ever want to read about the Great Magnetic Crusade, Professor Edward Larson at Pepperdine wrote a whole book about it.
The sound is pretty bad. Other people complain.
Empire of the Ice.
Then a connection goes off.
Hey, people listening, can you mute yourself, please?
Wait a minute.
Oh, yeah, but request for muting.
Huh?
I haven't had that request
Not
myself.
even worth listening to.
Okay, so the idea was that if you could go down to the Antarctic and compile all the exhaustive data you could, then that would mean you can come up with a systematic mathematical way to calculate declination and in view of where the South Magnetic Pole might be drifting and the rate of drift, then you would have precise exactitude in regard to navigation. But you would have to get the data, and that meant going down to the Antarctic. And nobody shared this dream more to really get for Great Britain the honors of all that magnetic data than the man here. And that is Clement Markham, who found himself at the head of the Royal Geographic Society at the end of the 19th century. And this would be the gateway to the great Antarctic exploration voyages to come. Now, he was a remarkable guy. He had come up in the Royal Navy as a young man, and he had joined in the efforts to try to find Franklin in the 1840s and 1850s. Markham, when he was young, was one of those who had come across the first graves found of the members of Franklin's expedition on Beechey's Island, which we talked about last year when I saw you. And then later on, after leaving the Navy, he achieved what would be absolutely crucial for the expansion of the British Empire, the ability to plant cinchona trees within British imperial dominion. And that meant they would never run out of quinine and thus be able to cure and treat malaria whenever they needed to. The conquest of the interior of Africa was unthinkable without those cinchona trees that Markham was able to find and plant. And that's why Winston Churchill said, the expansion of the British Empire has more to do with the gin and tonic than all the doctors who ever lived. Which is absolutely true. A mixed blessing for Africans, of course, but to the British Empire, a real boon. And Markham became Sir Clement Markham, became very famous, and he became head of the Royal Geographic Society later in life because of a unique series of events. By the 1890s, there was a big controversy in the great Royal Geographic Society of England, and the controversy had to do with women. There were women in the Royal Geographic Society, a grand total of 20 of them, full members, but many of the men in the Geographic Society didn't think they belonged there. After all, women were not supposed to travel alone. And if you can't travel alone, maybe you shouldn't be in the Royal Geographic Society. There's a huge controversy about this. And eventually, the head or the leaders of the Geographic Society came up with what they thought was a kind compromise. We'll let the women stay, but we won't let any more in. And of course, they'll be happy with that. Well, they weren't happy with that. The newspapers were filled with this controversy for months and months and months. The RGS looked like a bunch of old fogies, which is really what they were. And so they needed a new head after all this. And luckily, this guy, Clement Markham, had been taking a leave of absence from his membership in the society. And that meant he wasn't involved in this whole mess. He had never taken a stand. And so he's a natural guy to take over. And so by the end of the 1890s, here he was, head of the RGS. And he wanted to use that position to plunge into the Great Magnetic Crusade and go to Antarctica, fund a British expedition to do just that. And so he got to work and he began to raise money for a great expedition to Antarctica, the first major scientific expedition to below the Antarctic Circle. He got 5,000 pounds from the Royal Geographic Society. All of this is going to be pretty expensive. He got 25,000 pounds from a businessman named Llewellyn Longstaff. Remember that name, Llewellyn Longstaff. And he managed to get 40,000 pounds in matching funds from the British government. It's an excellent fundraiser, very convincing guy. We go to the next slide. And with all that money, he commissioned a brand new vessel to go down to Antarctica. And this is a previous slide. This is the, we're close. That's the vessel right there that they had especially built in the Royal Yards at Dundee in Scotland. And that is the first vessel ever made, especially for no other purpose than for Antarctic or Arctic exploration. And that's the RRS Discovery, Royal Research Ship Discovery. You can't see much about it, but one aspect of this that's interesting is that this is the very last three-masted wooden vessel ever built in the United Kingdom, the last one. And it was meant purely to go to Antarctica. And one thing that's maybe more noticeable is that the entire vessel is made of wood. Aside from a few steel elements, it's mostly wood, it's mostly oak. And the reason for that is they had to take these magnetic readings, and they didn't want any iron interrupting any of the readings they were taking. And so it's mostly an all wooden vessel and a beautiful ship as well. So they're getting this thing ready, they've commissioned it. Markham is beginning to hire the crew. Most of the crew is going to be from the Royal Navy. He was set upon that, not too much controversy about that. But one person he didn't have was a commander. who was actually going to command this expedition. Everybody began to talk about it. It's a very expensive thing. It's a very exciting prospect, but who was going to command it? And as he was beginning to think about that, one fine day, next slide, in 1899, Markham was on his way to Buckingham Palace, and who should come bounding across the street but 31-year-old Lieutenant Robert Falcon Scott. And here it is, Robert Falcon Scott. Everybody knew him as Con, but his full name, of course, Robert Falcon Scott. And the reason Scott crossed the street when he saw Clement Markham was that the two of them had met about 12 years before, when Robert Falcon Scott was an 18-year-old midshipman in the Royal Navy. At that point, Scott, just beginning his career, got in a little yacht race, you might call it, with other midshipmen in the Caribbean off the island of St. Kitts. Markham was there. He watched the race, very impressed with Scott and his seamanship. Markham and Scott had a nice lunch after this race when Scott was 18. And as Markham later put it in his diary, he found Scott a very charming boy indeed. And here he was a few years later, crossing the street. And Scott recognized Markham. Markham invited Scott to lunch. Let's have another lunch, second lunch in 12 years. And during the lunch, Scott impressed Markham again. And during the lunch, Markham said, you know, I'm looking for a commander of this expedition. Well, Robert Falcon Scott was only 31, only a lieutenant. He had only commanded these little torpedo vessels and really not what you call an independent command at all. But within 2 days, Scott had volunteered to command this expedition. He put his name in. And the reason he put his name in was Robert Falcon Scott was having some financial problems. His parents were gone. Well, his father had died, and that meant his mother was a widow and could not support herself. And Robert Falcon Scott also had sisters who were in need of financial support. Where was the money going to come from? And anyway, Robert Falcon Scott was ambitious. Promotion was slow in the Royal Navy. It was peacetime. Maybe this was just the thing. He could become well known. He could be making more pay as the commander of this expedition and could take care of his family better. No wonder he volunteered. And so it was that in June of 1900, he was selected as the head of this major expedition to the Antarctic. And they were almost ready to go. They just needed a few more members of the crew. They had to get the Discovery already. Next slide. And although most of the crew were from the Royal Navy, there was one major important exception. And it was that guy right there, Ernest Shackleton. Ernest Shackleton was not in the Navy at all. Shackleton was a merchant sailor. He was actually employed as something called the Union Castle Line in 1900. And what they were doing was taking people from the British Isles down to South Africa for the Boer War. Back and forth, back and forth. And he was on those vessels trying to make a name for himself in the merchant service. But his prospects were not all that great. What was he going to do? How far was he going to go? But he heard of this plan to go to the Antarctic, and he decided to volunteer for it. But there was no way this guy was ever going to get chosen. So many were going to be ahead of him. He wasn't in the Royal Navy after all, but he had one thing going for him. And the one thing going was he knew the son of guess who? That Longstaff guy, Llewellyn Longstaff. He was friends with that guy's son, talked to the son talked to the father talked to Markham. Shackleton got an interview and he was hired. I think he was just in his late 20s, I think, at the time. Now, he was the opposite from Robert Falcon Scott. These two had very little in common. Scott could be a rather dour fellow, didn't seem to have a great deal of emotion about him. Shackleton was just the opposite. He was warm, he was lively, and if people were around him seemed depressed, seemed like perhaps they were a little bit down, Shackleton always had a bit of poetry memorized that could he recite for the occasion, sing a doggerel bit of song if he wanted to, and everybody would feel just fine. He had a gift for getting along with people. Hardly anybody disliked Shackleton, except maybe Scott, as we'll see in a little while. But he was going to be a perfect fellow for an expedition in which people would be in close confinement for maybe as long as 3 years down there in the Antarctic. And so he was hired. And a big reason he wanted to go was maybe the service he was in, back and forth from South Africa, may not have been terribly interesting to him. But the other reason was he was in love with a woman named Emily Dorman. He wanted to impress her. And as you all know, the way to a woman's heart is to go to Antarctica. And there she is. That's Emily Dorman. And that's the woman that he deeply wanted to make love him. This is how he was going to do it. So they're all set to go finally. It's the Antarctic winter, the Northern Hemisphere summer. It's July 1901, and they're all set to go. On that month of July, the last thing that had to happen was the Discovery was anchored off the Isle of Wight in the Clement, a little bit of water between the mainland and the Isle of Wight. And the last thing that had to happen was King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra were going to come on board to say goodbye. This was a big deal. Everybody knows about this expedition. Next slide. And things kind of went wrong because Queen Alexandra's little Pekingese decided to jump overboard into the Clement. And luckily, one of the sailors on the Discovery had the presence of mind to dive into the Clement and rescue the little dog who would live another day. So off they go on the Discovery, and Scott and Shackleton and the rest of the crew soon found that she was a comfortable ship in many ways. The only difficulty, and this is something I would not have liked, was this, after all, was essentially the maiden cruise of the Discovery. There wasn't much of a shakedown period with the ship. So the thing was rolling. So you 45 degrees this way, 45 degrees that way sometimes. And they had a national total of 94 degrees at one point, a little over 45 each way as the seas got rougher. That would have been very uncomfortable. That would have been the end of my nautical career if I was on that ship. But these were sailors, they'd all been at sea before, and they put up with it, they soon got used to it. And down into the southern latitudes they went, and now we're in January of 1902, the Antarctic summer. Next slide. One of the first things they saw were great, go ahead, yes.
Who was the captain, Scott or Shackleton?
Scott.
Okay.
Scott's in charge.
Okay.
Yeah. And one of the things they saw down there, if you look at, we'll see a map in a second, but if this is Antarctica, here's the Ross Ice Shelf. Over on this side of it was where they began to poke around the coast at first, in what they called Edward VII land. So one of the things that they found were these great flocks of Adelie penguins, as you can see here. The Adelie penguins had first been identified by Ross back in the 1840s, but they were named after the wife of a French explorer whose name was Adelie. They've been called Adelie penguins ever since. And there were these vast flocks of them. People couldn't believe how many of these penguins there were. And they soon figured out the other thing everybody knows about penguins. They're beautiful creatures, wonderful creatures. What's the other thing everybody knows about them?
It smells.
They smell. They smell the high heaven. There's guano all around them, of course, all the time. The little guano of the penguins looks like anchovies.
Yeah.
It just will spoil your appetite. But one person tried to describe the smell of these flocks of penguins, and I thought I would read the description to you. You might have heard this one. You want to know how big flocks of penguins smell? Here's what you do. You take some old cigarette tobacco, you soak it in ammonia, add rotting shrimp, then leave it out in the yard for a few days, and you'll have some idea about what the smell was. There were so many of these Adelies that one member of the expedition, who happened to go on shore with a few others, decided to take a shot at a petrel. So this petrel off in the distance, missed the petrel, but killed 5 Adelies at once with one shot. And that's how thick they were on the ground. Well, they began, the expedition did, to map the coast a little bit better than was known at the time. Now we can go to the next slide. And they're over here on this part of the coast right there, other side of the Ross Ice Shelf from McMurdo. McMurdo's there. This is where they were, just at first. And it occurred to Scott that since it's the high summer in the Antarctic, maybe this would be a good time to go up in the air. Because it turned out they had a balloon on the Discovery. So a party of them landed, they dragged the balloon ashore on King Edward VII land and decided to go up and see what they could see. Next slide. And the first person to go up on the balloon was, of course, Robert Falcon Scott himself, commander of the expedition. The balloon, as you can see, was tethered to the ice, tethered to the ground where they were. He gets in the basket, he goes up about 500 feet. And once he was at 500 feet, he made what I consider to be an erratic decision. And we'll see that Robert Falcon Scott did not always make the right decisions. And this might be our first example. He decided to take the sandbags up there in the balloon and just toss them out all at once. And because he did that, this balloon just jets up in the air. And for a few anxious moments, Scott figured that the tethers are not going to hold. And that would have meant that would be the last we'd ever seen of Robert Falcon Scott. Who knows where that balloon would have ended up in the wilderness. But the tether held 700 feet now, tether held, and down goes Robert Falcon Scott, the first man ever to fly over Antarctica, Robert Falcon Scott. And if I had seen that, I would have been back on the ship and never would have looked at the balloon again. But guess who decided he wanted to take a ride? Shackleton. And by now, Shackleton was maybe the most popular member of the crew. Everybody called him Shackles on the Discovery. And it looked like so much fun to him. He got in the balloon and up he went. So now you can tell all your friends that the first two people ever to fly in Antarctica were Robert Falcon Scott and Ernest Shackleton, maybe the most famous Antarctic explorers anyway. So they did that. Then, as the Antarctic summer went on, they went past the Ross Ice Shelf that we just saw on the map. And if you go to the next slide, they began to get closer to where they would spend the winter. And where they were going to spend the winter, this is kind of a blurry slide, but they were going to build a small encampment, if they could, here on Ross Island, on the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf, looking out over McMurdo Sound, which is about as far as you can get south in seawater and still be relatively comfortable. And so that's where they were going to be, and that's where they ended up in February of 1902. That's where their winter encampment was going to be. And here is where things began to maybe go a bit wrong for the Discovery, because among other things, they just weren't accustomed, many of the crew, to the hardships and the particular challenges of any kind of Antarctic or Arctic exploration. And that soon became apparent when the Discovery anchored, and they began to build a hut on Ross Island. You can go to the next slide. This is the hut they built. Now you might have seen this hut, but that hut is still there on Ross Island. And the idea was to spend the winter on land, but they soon figured out that the Discovery would be much more comfortable as quarters. So they used this hut mostly for storage and sometimes for meteorological readings during the winter. The Discovery, you wouldn't call it cozy or warm. In fact, it was so cold in the officers' quarters that the only way Scott could sit at his desk was to wrap his feet in layers and layers of sawdust, so he wouldn't feel as if his feet were freezing. But it was better, they thought, than out here in the hut. And so they were mostly on the Discovery during the winter. But what went wrong for them was the fact that they were simply inexperienced in a lot of what this kind of exploration and living entailed. To go to the next slide, here's the Discovery, the way it looked like in McMurdo Sound as the ice set in during the winter of 1902. And that would be the home of most of the crew. Now we go to the next slide. Now here's one thing they didn't understand. And Amundsen understood this, Nansen understood this, remember him from last time, but not Scott and not this expedition, that if you want to go inland in the Arctic or the Antarctic, the best way to travel is by dogs, specifically these Siberian Huskies. And there's a couple of reasons they're so good. One reason is that, like most dogs, when they begin to lose heat, they lose heat towards the extremities. So their paws don't freeze. We get frostbite all the time. Our heat goes into the core. Their heat goes to the extremities. So that's good if you want to travel in the Arctic. The other good thing about them, some of you may know, is that if you're a husky, unlike other dogs, there's never a point when all four paws are above the ice. There's always a paw on the snow. There's always one paw on the ice. That allows them to propel the sleds more efficiently. They're great for Arctic transport. In fact, they're really the only thing for Arctic transport. But Scott did not understand that. Nobody on the Discovery knew how to use these dogs. And they didn't know the one principal basic fact, which is that if you want to try to pull a sled with a dog, you got to help the dog pull the sled. The dogs are going to cooperate. A dog will not pull the sled if a man is pulling the sled too. At least these dogs wouldn't. And that meant that it was going to be the dogs or man hauling. And unfortunately, Scott, in this expedition, had such a bad experience, as we'll see with the dogs, that he came to believe that man-hauling sledges was better, which it isn't. It's disastrously bad. But Scott came to that decision, as we'll see. Now, the other thing they didn't understand was skiing. The Norwegians skied second nature. If you want to get by, if you're a man, a woman, you ski in these conditions. None of them really knew how to ski. During that first winter, late summer, when they got there in February, they decided to learn how to ski all this. And Scott right away injured his leg really bad, falling down on the skis. And then more tragically, none of the expedition left the Discovery. They went out on Ross Island to look around. It's March. It's not too cold yet. It's still light in March, of course. So they decided to go out on Ross Island, go to the edge of it if they could, on skis. But the problem was they didn't know how to use skis. And they were soon falling and tripping all over themselves. And even more disastrously, some of them gave up, just went on boots to get where they could up towards Cape Crozier on Ross Island. And at one point, these guys are trying to get back, and now the snow is blowing. There's a storm going on, coastal storm, really terrible conditions. It's gloomy, can barely see. And at one point, they were sliding almost uncontrollably. Most of them stopped at the last second because there was a precipice right in front of them. And below the precipice was the Ross Sea, nothing but seawater. But one of the guys, his name was Vince, couldn't stop because his boots were too soft. They couldn't get any grip in the ice. And down over the precipice he went into the icy waters of the Ross Sea. And that was it for him. Next slide. This is the first step of the expedition. And all they could do was make a cross in his memory. This man, George Vince, who had died on Cape Crozier, and that cross is still there to this day. If you visit McMurdo Sound in Ross Island, you can see that cross memorialized. What was really a needless step? If they'd known more about these conditions, it should never have happened. And what some of them began to do was improvise, and they would take these nails and nail them into their boots to get some sort of traction if they needed to. Not perfect, but maybe better than what the alternative was. And it soon became pretty clear to Scott that fairly young man that he was with no independent command before this, maybe he wasn't quite up to this. Now, he never let on, but there's reason to think he was feeling more insecure as these events began to happen, and especially as the challenges of Antarctic travel were something that he was going to have to learn as he went, learn pretty much on the job. Well, on the bright side of this, the whole purpose of this expedition was scientific work, and they soon got down to work, even during the Antarctic winter, to learn all they could about magnetic data and anything else that they thought was important. They eventually did figure out not exactly what the self-magnetic pole was, but a better estimate than what they had before, and that was important. They took magnetic readings whenever they could. That was important. They took temperature readings, meteorological readings. It didn't matter how cold it was. It didn't matter how dark it was in July and August. Every 2 hours, despite the condition, somebody went out and they took meteorological readings out on the ice, Ross Island or the Ross Ice Shelf. They did that faithfully, and they did that all the time. They made some clumsy mistakes. A lot of their thermometers were mercury thermometers, and that meant that the mercury froze. I think 38 degrees below freezing centigrade is when they froze. So that's not ideal because it got colder than that. But they did the best they could, and they came up with a wealth of data. And scientifically, this expedition is usually thought of as a success. But we don't really remember this for the science. One thing they figured out, by the way, emperor penguins. I think that's the next slide. Let's see, maybe. Yeah, there they go. Here's another glimpse of that. Emperor penguins, Scott and the expedition were the first to gather evidence of the famous migration of emperor penguins, which is now one of the story parts of the natural world. But what we remember this expedition for was something else. And that was because of a decision that Scott made towards the end of 1902, as the Antarctic summer was just beginning to set in October and into November. Now we go to the next slide. And it occurred to Scott that maybe they should try to embark upon a journey and go as far south as they could. And maybe, if everything went well, and everything broke just as perhaps ideally they might, perhaps such an expedition could get to the South Pole itself. The Royal Geographic Society never thought that this expedition would go to the South Pole. That wasn't the point. Nobody thought that was the point. But Scott began to figure, we think, that if he wanted an enduring reputation to really go down in history, then magnetic data readings weren't the way to do it. Maybe getting to the South Pole was the way to do it. And he was down there, it's the summer, it's the end of 1902. Why not try? Why not give it a shot? And so in November, they put together a party of 3 men who had tried to get as close as they could to the pole. And the 3 men are Shackleton, Scott, who's going to command the three-member group, of course. And there'll be a 3rd member, a really popular fellow, liked by everybody, named Edward Wilson. Everybody called him Billy Wilson. Billy Wilson was the artist of the expedition and also one of the doctors. Of course, if you're going to try to get to the pole, why not bring a doctor along? So Shackleton, Scott, and Wilson were trying to make it to the pole. We got to set out in November 1902. 3 men, a bunch of supplies, and 19 dogs. 19 dogs that none of them really knew how to use. But that's what they're going to start out with. And then the day came, and over the Ross Ice Shelf, they began to go. Ever south, they hoped, towards the South Pole. Everybody waved goodbye. All 3 of them wrote letters to their loved ones. The last words they wanted to share with them, just in case they never came back. Shackleton was not married to his loved one, of course, not yet, but he wrote her a letter anyway. Into the depths of the Antarctic, they went. And things went well at first. Sometimes the snow blew very hard. They could barely see what was in front of them. But if it got too bad, not such a problem at first, still plenty of food. So they would all gather together in this big reindeer fur tent they had. They snuggled up, all 3 of them. And if the snow was too thick, somebody would read from Darwin on the origin of species until the other 2 fell asleep. Then they would keep going. It was gray at first, it was gloomy, but they were making pretty good progress. And their spirits lifted a few days later when the sun came out. After a couple of weeks, it's not too bad, they're doing well, going over the Ross Ice Shelf, going ever further south and ever further south. And maybe there was a time when Scott felt we're doing pretty well, maybe we could get to the pole. It wasn't going to be easy. The pole was over 800 miles from McMurdo Sound, where they were 800 miles, it's a long way. But if progress went well, who knows, maybe they could do it. And everybody would remember their names from time onward, to the end of everything. And no matter what Markham thought, maybe that would be the goal of this expedition. That would land this expedition in history. Not bad progress. But then the problems began. And how to do with the sled dogs. Nobody knew anything about it. So we go to the next slide. This is where they're going to try to get across the ice shelf. And they'll eventually have to get across the trans-Antarctic mountains, as you'll see. But they're about here when the story really reached its height, just across, maybe halfway over the ice shelf. And that's when the dogs began to die. And the reason the dogs, who are crucial to pulling those sledges, of course, the reason the dogs began to die was that the food Scott was told to take for the dogs was fish. And the fish, unfortunately, was rotting by now. And if you feed rotting fish to the dogs, that's almost worse than nothing. That's going to sicken them, they're going to lose energy. And the dogs did begin to lose energy. And they were making less and less progress every day on these heavy sledges filled with supplies. Now, one way when the dogs slow down is to get them going again, is to beat the dogs. And somebody like Nansen used to travel in the Arctic, understood that. Nobody liked feeding Siberian Huskies, but you want to go forward, things are getting difficult, maybe you need to. But Robert Falcon Scott, one of the core elements of his being was he was an animal lover. He couldn't imagine beating a dog. He wouldn't do it. And the result was they had to get forward some other way as the dogs weakened. And what they decided to do was adopt a system where they would get to a certain point, they'd unload half the supplies, they'd have the dogs pull half the supplies on the sledges to another point, then they'd all go back with empty sledges and pick up the other half of the supplies and then get going again to the point where they reached. And of course, you see what that means. Every day, they're working twice as hard to go the same distance, right? Because they're making 2 trips every single day. And they felt that's the only way to preserve the dogs. Scott, by now, had made the terrible mistake of getting to know the dogs, naming the dogs. Should never do that in the Antarctic. You get too close to them. But he was emotionally involved with them. And that's going to cause trouble later on. I think if there's one rule with the Antarctic and the Arctic, if you want to get really far in those depths, you got 2 choices. Either you learn that you may have to eat the dogs, or you stay home. And that's the sad thing about it. It's very sad. Ultimately, though, Scott will be faced with that tough choice. But to make any progress at all, in fact, poor Billy Wilson, who also loved dogs, began to have to kill the weakest of the dogs and feed those dogs to the stronger dogs in order to keep any of them alive. He hated to do it, but he had to. And Scott couldn't watch it. And Scott was ashamed of himself because he didn't have the stomach to watch that. Dogs killed to feed other dogs. But there was no other way to go. There was no other way to proceed. His tempers began to flare because he was feeling discouraged. He was feeling sickened by what had to be done with those poor dogs. And he eventually, as time went on, November turned to December, eventually he began to lose his temper. And at one point, he really kind of suffered an outburst in Wilson's and Shackleton's direction, the other 2. He called them a couple bloody fools, or you're a bloody fool. Which they weren't, but he lost his temper. And Shackleton turned to Scott in the depths of these wastes, and he said, if you're referring to me, I want you to know, Shackleton said, you are the worst bloody fool of the lot, Scott. And every time you speak like that to me, you will get it right back. These 3 were beginning not to get along. Not a good time. We're getting to the pole. But finally, early December, they did cross the 80th parallel. They got to 80 degrees south. Great achievement. Far further south than anybody had ever gone before. The first humans to do that. And they were getting closer. They could see them moving at the horizon to these trans-Antarctic mountains. They're eventually going to have to figure out a good way to get across them. They know that. But what was really on their minds by now was hunger. They were naming mountains. There's a Mount Markham there, of course, after Clement Markham. But the thing they couldn't get out of their minds was the progressing, increasing hunger they were feeling. What they thought about was food. What you need, go to the next slide, for energy in the Arctic or Antarctic is something like this. That's pemmican. We talked about pemmican last year. Pemmican is fat in dried beef. Often it's buffalo or deer meat. And you put in some berries in there, put enough berries, that's going to help against scurvy, of course. Pemmican is great. It travels well. It's really filling, gives you a bunch of energy. And unfortunately, Scott did not carry enough pemmican on those sledges. He could have used a bunch of seal meat. Penguin meat would have been good against scurvy. Didn't have that on the sledges. And they began to run out of food. We began to run low. And by the way, it's so valuable that they fought a big war in the Canadian prairie over pemmican. Anybody care to guess the name of the war? The pemmican. The pemmican war. But Scott hadn't brought enough with it. And so their appetites were never satisfied. They were now very tired. They were suffering. They were hungry. But the sun was still out. And the sun gave them some hope as they continued to go south. Another person who suffered was poor Billy Wilson. It was so beautiful to him, this wilderness, despite the hunger. So Wilson was always taking his goggles off, and that meant snow blindness in the Antarctic, and he began to go blind for periods of time. Of course, he couldn't paint then. He was getting very discouraged. But on they went, on they went. The dogs were increasingly very little good. Scott finally made the decision to stop the sledges that were carrying too much provisions. So he set up a supply depot with most of the provisions that were left. And with a much lightened series of sledges, they kept going, trying to get as far south as they could. That worked for a while, but it wasn't going to work forever. By Christmas, they didn't think they could go much further. On Christmas Day, the last happy day of the expedition occurred. Shackleton surprised Wilson and Scott by reaching down in one of his socks and pulling out a Christmas pudding that he'd saved all this time. And they feasted on this little pudding. That was Shackleton all over on December 25th. But that was it. That was the last good moment. They got to 82 degrees south. It's a long way. 2 miles further south than anybody had ever gone before, 82 degrees. And then Scott made the decision to turn back. No point in going any further. Go any further, we're never going to get back. The depot was there. The depot's not going to be enough. So they decided to turn back. He'd almost waited too long. Already low on food. They cut their caloric input down to the bone as far as they could go. Poor Wilson had to keep killing the last of the dogs. None of the dogs survived. What they should have done was to fend off scurvy is to eat the meat of the last of the dogs they had to kill. But Scott could not bring himself to do that. They didn't do that. They did the best they could. Further north, day after painstaking day, back towards McMurdo. Their scurvy was getting worse. And probably the saddest day of all for them really was the day that the last dog had to be killed. Scott wrote in his diary, I don't have the strength to write about it. I can't write about this. It's just too sad. He got to know the dogs, of course. And all they had to think of now was survival. First, that might have threatened to die was Shackleton. Shackleton began to weaken. His scurvy was more advanced than anybody else's. And as some of you may know, Shackleton, although he didn't talk about it, had a bad heart condition. Really should never have been under these conditions. Heart condition would kill him eventually. And the day, they got to the day where he couldn't pull the sledges anymore. Now they're all man-hauling, right? He couldn't pull. So he had to push the sledges from behind. And there were times when he had to ride in the back of the sledges. And what he always said was, he rode only when I thought riding was the best way to balance the sledge and make sure that it wouldn't go too quickly over the ice, maybe upset itself. Scott, however, in his account of all this, simply said that Shackleton rode part of the way. And that poisoned Shackleton against Scott. Shackleton never thought he gave anything less than his utmost to this journey back to McMurdo. But nevertheless, he did at certain points ride on the sledge. And this source of ill will was not going to go away. The month of January went on and on, one lingering day after day of torment for all three. And then the day came on February 3rd. They knew they were getting close to McMurdo, but they didn't think they were too close. And they peered into the gloom, a little bit of snow blowing around, and they could see these specks. There were these specks up there, and they thought they were big penguins, but they weren't. They were their comrades from the Discovery who had come out to look for them and save them. And they were safe. And all three of them were sick. All three of them looked awful. Leathery skin, skeletal. They had these long beards by now, chapped. Lips were black, but they survived. And the Discovery threw them a great party. They got back to the ship after 93 days on the ice, trying to get as close as they could to the South Pole. And you go to the next slide, we're almost at the end. This, of course, is a modern picture, something about what a dog sled looks like. Those beautiful Chukchi huskies, right? So here he's here. Now we go to the last slide. And the end of our presentation for today comes when the next year, after another year in the Antarctic, the next year, Scott returned home, a hero. Now, he hadn't gone to the South Pole, but nobody expected him to get to the South Pole. But he made this farthest south record, and he was promoted to captain. He's now Captain Robert Falcon Scott. He got married to the sculptor Kathleen Bruce, formidable personality, as we'll see. Kathleen Bruce, our friend of Gertrude Stein and Isadora Duncan. Now, you talk about the kind of people Robert Falcon Scott usually wouldn't hang out with, Gertrude Stein. Well, now he's going to get to know these. Now, his life is going to change. And his life was going to change because he was now famous. He was now a hero because he'd done so well, getting so far south. He stayed for a week with King Edward and Alexandra up at Balmoral. of the kind of thing he was used to. He got a medal from everybody. Any society in Britain that exists was going to give him a medal now. There was scads of medals. He's a big national hero. He made more in one lecture than he ever made in a month in the Royal Navy. So he's doing pretty well. Everything's fine because Britain needed a hero. After all, after the very, you might say, ambiguous result of the Boer War, Robert Falcon Scott seemed to show that the bold white stuff of the empire was still in existence here in the early 20th century. And I'm glad to say before I forget that Robert and Kathleen would have a son. That son, Sir Peter Scott, true to his father, Sir Peter Scott would go on to be one of the founders of the World Wildlife Fund. So the love of animals continued in the family. Now, Robert Scott was lionized, famous everywhere now. What about Shackleton? Shackleton got home a little earlier. He was picked up because he was so sick by a relief ship. So he got home before Scott did. And something had happened to Shackleton. He did get married to Emily Dorman. That part of his plan worked. But I think something unexpected happened. He became infused with a love for Antarctica. And he would never forget it. He would never get over that. And he was determined to go back. He was determined to be the first man to the South Pole. Scott was beginning to think about his own expedition. Shackleton was determined to get there before Scott. He was determined to try to get there first. He went to work as a PR guy for a factory owner. The factory owner was a guy named Beardmore, famous geographic name in Antarctica eventually. And Beardmore agreed to put up 20,000 pounds for Shackleton to go back and see if he could get further south. And the Royal Geographic Society also agreed to help, much to the dismay of Scott himself. And so as Shackleton began to prepare the next big expedition to the South Pole, Scott contacted him. Scott told him, not much I can do about it if you want to try before me, but you can't use McMurdo. McMurdo is my base. Ross Island is my base. That's where the Discovery was. Shackleton thought that was ridiculous. You don't own McMurdo Sound. But he agreed out of a sense of chivalry, perhaps, that if he was going to get to the South Pole, he would have started with McMurdo. He would start from the underside, maybe, of the Ross Ice Shelf, over by what they call the Bay of Whales. And we'll see if Shackleton kept that pledge next time. But this is the Discovery. If you want to see the Discovery, just go to Scotland. It's there in Dundee. They'll give you a tour of it. You can see Scott's cabin where he would keep his diary and make his records. It's extremely well kept. It's one of the great ship memorials in Great Britain. RRS Discovery. And we're about to meet Shackleton in his next attempt. One of the most incredible stories in all polar exploration, Shackleton's attempt to get to the South Pole, which is going to happen in a few years, and for us next week. So that's all for today. And we're up to the 3 p.m. mark. Everybody, you're not a captive audience. You can escape into the sunlight, or you can ask a question if you want to, or make a comment. Go ahead.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what they were eating. So I just saw the Discovery being large enough to hold, you know, all the lumber and everything else was needed. Yeah, they had a bunch of ship biscuit. There were a bunch of biscuits, which is not really the best food for them. But they had a bunch of that. They had dried meat, a good bit of that as well, stored away. For a while, I think they had live animals on board that they slaughtered as the months went on. And they tried to take as much of the way of fresh fruits and vegetables as they could. It's just that a lot of that wasn't on the sledges when Scott and Wilson and Shackleton tried to get to the South Pole. But they had most of the provisions you'd expect for a long sea journey into the Discovery. It's deceptive. They can hold a lot on that hold that you can't really tell much just by looking at the picture. And there weren't that many crew members. I can't remember exactly. Maybe there were 32 members of this whole expedition. So not that many that had to be fed. So it was just a relatively small number of people.
Are penguins edible?
Yeah, penguins are good for you. So one of the things that we just mentioned this last year, but the first ship to spend a winter in Antarctica was the Belgian guy. The Belgian expedition, the end of the 19th century. And they found out through Dr. Cook that penguins were actually good to fend off scurvy. Penguins would keep you alive. They didn't need a whole lot of penguins on this journey, though. It was something Scott was reluctant to do. But he was also reluctant to have seals killed. Seal meat is good for you, especially if it's raw, depending on scurvy, nutritious. So very grudgingly, Scott allowed seals to be slaughtered, and that's another way to survive so long, off the seals. Yeah, go ahead.
They were trying to into this like of magnetic pole to the
Yeah.
whatever.
Well, it would have to be different because the distance between the poles, magnetic would be different. So it all has to do with the difference between magnetic and true north or south. So the angles would always be distinct, and they change over time. Magnetic poles move, which makes it difficult. But one thing they wanted to do is maybe if they're there for a few years, if they know where the south magnetic pole is, they can figure out the rate of change. And the rate of change is really valuable. Then you could just have tables of declination that you could depend on. Maybe you wouldn't have to take measurements all the time. But that was something they don't have to be for years and years to really figure that out. And they didn't really make a very good start of it because they couldn't pinpoint where the south magnetic pole was, not where the discovery was. But we'll see that Shackleton was going to make another attempt at that. We're going to try again. Yeah.
Dr. Wilson.
We're going to hear from him. Wilson, who kept everybody's spirits up, who was indomitable, who would do anything that had to be done. In fact, it seemed like he could do it. He was superhuman. Scott thought that he was the most impressive character he'd ever met in his life. Scott adored Wilson. And Wilson would stick with Scott. And as we'll see, Scott's ill-fated expedition to find the South Pole. Shackleton wanted Wilson to join him. But Wilson felt loyal to Scott. Disastrously for Wilson, as we'll see. But we'll meet him later on. Yeah?
Was Scott still in the Royal Navy at the start of the expedition? What was the situation then that he could just jump onto this expedition rather than what he was doing for the Navy?
Well, luckily it wasn't wartime. And the Royal Navy had a policy of granting extended leaves of absence, especially if achievements could be done that way that would reflect well on the Navy, which was certainly the case here. So he had his commission, he was drawing his salary, but he didn't have an active command while he was preparing these expeditions. But he was Captain Scott. So by the time he was 35, he was a captain. Not bad. In peacetime, captain is pretty high rank. Yeah, go ahead.
How do you know where the geographic South Pole is?
Well, with the geographic South Pole, well, you get to the point where the latitude is 90, right?
Right.
So 90 degrees. You measure that with the sun. The sun is out.
Okay.
Yeah. Not that I'm an expert on that, but I think that's what they would do. So and we'll see how they eventually did that, actually. That's a good question. How would you know if you were at the spot that's the South Pole? And we'll see what they did, because that was a problem. I mean, the exact spot. Amundsen figured out a way to. Yeah.
How did they know about the Antarctic range there before you get to the South Pole? Was somebody there before?
No, nobody ever been amidst those mountains before them. But if you're on Ross Island or the ice shelf on a clear day, you can see those mountains. What they didn't know is if that was a mountain chain or if they were a bunch of islands between the ice shelf and the mainland. That's what they didn't know. But they knew they were there. They could see those peaks. And as the peaks loomed larger and larger and larger, as this first expedition went towards them, the conviction grew on all three that that was a land-based mountain range. It's probably what it was. And that expedition actually proved it, not just because these three could see it, but another expedition during the discovery years that we didn't talk about, from 1901 to 1904, they made another excursion off in a different direction. And they actually got among those mountains. So you can see they were in among the Transantarctic range. And they could look beyond them. And they were the first people ever to see what we call the polar plateau, which is where the pole actually is. They didn't go as far south as Scott did, but they were among the tail end of the mountains. But that's one of their achievements, actually. And I think that might be it. Okay, next week. Well, it's a beautiful day. I appreciate it.